Welcome to CSI Chat, where every topic's fair game. From finance to mysteries, we'll never be the same. Our host an accountant with a knack for a joke. We'll dive into the details and laugh until we choke. CSI Chat, where the numbers beat the fun. We'll explore every subject under the sun.
Okay, well, we are very lucky today to be joined by Scott Anthony. I'm going to give a little bit of background on Scott, and then we'll dig right into it. So Scott is a clinical professor of strategy at the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth College, focused on the adaptive challenges of disruptive change. And very timely topic given all of the discussions that are going on right now with respect to artificial intelligence. He spent more than 20 years at Innosight, the growth strategy consultancy founded by Harvard Business School professor Clayton Christensen. And he's also the author of 9 books, including his newest, Epic Disruptions, 11 Innovations that shaped our modern world. And I've read the book. And again, I would highly recommend you take a read of it because if you really want to understand disruption, there's no better way to do that than by learning through probably the past, 300-400 years of disruptions that occurred during our, during the history or more recent history. And it's very interesting looking at these in hindsight and really trying to apply the learnings of those disruptions to really what's going on today, which is really what we're here to talk about. But maybe, Scott, I think it would be good to understand a little bit first. First of all, thank you very much for joining. We really appreciate you taking the time. But it sounds like before you were a professor at Tuck, is that you actually spent a lot of time in the private sector, let's call it, at Innosight, and over 20 years, I believe, at Innosight. And maybe just give us a little bit of background on what you did at Innosight. You know, you can't read your book without getting a really good understanding as well about Clayton Christensen. I believe he passed away not that long ago. But it's clearly Clayton had a pretty significant impact on your career as well, and obviously was one of the founders of Innosight. But give us some perspective on Innosight. Why did you join there, and what did you do there for 20 years?
Well, Scott, first of all, thank you very much for having me as part of this discussion. I'm always thrilled to talk about epic disruptions, disruptive innovation, and all related content. There's a very long answer to that question. I won't give you what, I'll give you kind of the highlights of it. It starts in the year 2000. I'm a student at the Harvard Business School. I take Clay Christensen's class, Building and Sustaining a Successful Enterprise, and I basically intellectually fall in love with the idea. I didn't know what I wanted to do after graduation, so Clay said he had some money from the dean, could hire a couple researchers, so I stuck around for a couple of years, led his research team. We wrote a book together. And then in 2003, I joined the team at Innosight. And it wasn't because I wanted to be a consultant. I had done consulting prior to business school. I thought it was a fine job, but I wasn't super passionate about being an advisor. But I was incredibly passionate about the idea of disruptive innovation and the opportunity to be in the field working with real business leaders who had real challenges of disruptive innovation was fascinating to me. And that was essentially the next 2 decades of my life, working with top executives in companies around the globe, helping them defend against disruptive attacks, seize disruptive opportunities, build capabilities to go and turn the ambiguity that comes along with disruption into an opportunity. It really was an amazing place to essentially do applied research and also help companies be better. So that is the connection to Innosight and the idea of disruption.
Yeah, what were some of the common themes you would see in those 20 years? Late 90s, early 2000s, we're probably talking about the tech bubble, and that, we all were, for those of us who have been around, there was some, even in the late 90s, you almost thought it was going to be the end of the world in 2000 when all those computers had to roll over from 1999 to the year 2000. And then, the tech, in the dot-com bubble. What were some of the common themes that you would be dealing with companies with at least at that point in time?
Well, in the early days, back in 2003, a lot of it was still the first generation of the commercial internet. So what does it mean as we now start thinking about digitizing our business in very basic ways? that begins to lead you to say, okay, one of the things that the internet does is enable the creation of what we now would call new business models, new ways to create, deliver, and capture value. So that as a thematic area became a really big deal because that's not just about what you do online. Every company has a business model. Every company thinks about pressures and challenges to it. The really interesting thing as I reflect on your question is while I was there, a big shift happened. I didn't really notice it until I stepped away and stepped back from it. I remember the very first thing Clay asked me to do. This is in the spring of 2001. He asked me to do a research study comparing his work to Jeffrey Moore, who wrote Crossing the Chasm and a couple other things. And the task was go and find a couple disruptions that I have not already written about so we can go study them. It was not an easy task because
Yeah.
disruption was in pockets. It was episodic. Clay had already written about all the big ones, so what else was there? You fast forward to today and you ask, can you identify an ongoing disruption? Look to your left, to your everywhere, everywhere. Disruption has gone from something that was episodic, that a few organizations were thinking about, to something that is truly endemic. It is the condition that every organization leader now faces. That was happening while I was at Insight, but I didn't notice it. It was just the business environment. But I think it is a really important shift in our world.
I totally agree. Um, so you spend 20 plus years at Insight, and then you make a decision to, really switch up from the corporate world into academia. I don't know how common that shift is. That would seem to be a little bit uncommon, especially after spending so much time in the corporate world. But give us some perspective on that change. Why did you decide to go from the corporate world at Insight into academia?
A couple answers I would give. First, it was part of the long-term plan.
Okay.
2007 and again in 2008, I applied to and got into a doctoral program. And had I followed that path, I would have been a traditional research-based scholar and professor and all that. I ultimately decided that was not what the world wanted for me. So I went back to the field and said, I still want to get to the classroom, but I want to do it in the applied route as opposed to the scholarly route. So it was kind of the long-term plan. And when I made the transition, it was kind of the time. That's part number one. Part number two, something I actually had wrong. So consulting is a really hard job. Every
Yeah.
day it's hand-to-hand combat. You're fighting against sometimes the problem, sometimes the client, sometimes the team, sometimes the world. And there's a part of me that says, education's just going to be a little bit easier, a little bit slower lifestyle. The thing I learned very quickly is that all fields are really difficult if you are going to excel at them. And
Absolutely.
education has proven to be differently difficult than consulting. And by the way, I officially joined the faculty July 1st, 2022. 4 months later, ChatGPT 3.5 comes out. So we are on the front line of dealing with disruptive change because all we have is our brains and all we have are ideas. So large language models are a really disruptive force inside classrooms for good, for
Absolutely.
bad. And we don't know the answers. So we're all collectively figuring it out.
You could make an argument that the folks most disrupted by ChatGPT and some of these LLMs are students, at all different ages, because it really brings cheating to the forefront. You know what I mean? You can call it cheating. You can call, maybe cheating is a strong word. But it's certainly going to be interesting in 20 years when, these students have grown into professionals and maybe learned under a different way than we all learned to see what happens. But this whole thing about like online tests and things like that, when you got ChatGPT sitting there beside you is, the world has changed. You know what I mean?
If you just take that one thread for a second. So, full credit to Joe Hall, the dean of the MBA program, then the dean of teaching at Talk. When ChatGPT came out, he said, look, this is a big deal. We got to do something with it. The great news is we have what you would call in academic terms an adaptive space in the classroom. In the classroom, you essentially are an entrepreneur. You can do lots of different things. So Joe said within the classroom, guardrails. So don't break any laws, don't violate copyright, et cetera, but strong encouragement to go and experiment with
Hmm.
artificial intelligence so we can begin to figure it out. Create a working group that both allows collective learning and also can be kind of a holding environment for the emotions that people are feeling, which are pretty intense. And from that, you begin to learn things really rapidly, like online tests have to go. So they just have to go. It's just too easy. You're back to in class, pen and paper, blue books. So we go, some professors go so far as to say, hey, I know you might have biological reasons to leave the room, but not during this test. So no trips to the bathroom because it's just too tempting to take out the phone and begin to do something. One
Agree.
professor has gone back to oral exams. I'm going to sit down with every student at the end of the term, spend 30 to 60 minutes with them to see what they've actually learned. The good thing about what our dean did is we got there really fast because we were learning experimentally. We were learning through the things that we were doing, which allowed us to say, hey, we're not reading what other people are experiencing it. We're seeing it firsthand. And this is still very early days. Exactly how this is all going to play out, who knows? One of the businesses I would love for someone to form, by analogy, you go back 100 years ago, there are no gyms. Why do you need a gym? People are working in the fields, so they don't need something to go and stretch and stress their muscles. When white collar work takes over, you need gyms. You need places where you purposefully go and exercise. We're going to need the same thing for this
Yeah.
because it is way too easy just to offload everything to AI. And we all know if you don't think, if you don't stretch your brain, it does not develop. So I imagine 20 years from now, there's going to be some kind of gym for brains. I don't know exactly what it'll look like. It's got to be more fun than school, but something that allows us to stretch and develop it and not turn into those fat people from Wally.
I I agree. Wally's a great movie as well. Wally really makes you think. If you haven't seen that movie out there, yes, it's a kids movie. It's a Disney movie, or I guess it is a Disney movie because I think it's produced by, I believe it's by Pixar. I
Yeah, it's a
believe. I'm not
Pixar movie.
100% sure,
Yeah,
but
it
that
is.
is a great reference, Scott. I love that reference. I love that movie. Got an amazing plot, but yeah, when you look at what the future can hold on on how the people operate, it's a very interesting movie. And for anyone listening, if you haven't seen that movie, and you really want to understand disruption, go out and watch it because it's a terrific, terrific movie. I totally agree with that.
I fully agree with that. We were just having a family discussion about the best Pixar movie, and Wally was my nomination, not only for best Pixar movie, I think you can put it up there with just about anything. The first 13 minutes are filmmaking at its finest, in my personal opinion.
Yeah, I look, Pixar's made a lot of great movies, and yeah, no, that would certainly be certainly. And again, who we're going to talk about him in a second. He doesn't get enough credit, but Steve Jobs, again, I think he made more money off Pixar than he ever did off Apple. I think at least at one point it was like that. But you talk about leaders in disruption. We're going to get to Jobs in a second, but he was the funder. He saw something in Pixar that that thing was burning a lot of cash in the early days, and he was there to, he saw something in that team that probably no one else saw.
Yeah,
But we'll get to
totally
Jobs
agree.
in a second.
I will
He
say just
credits
one
the iPhone, but man, there's a lot of other stuff there behind
any
Jobs'
anyone
name.
who anyone who wants to understand what it takes to really build a culture that encourages creativity. Ed Catmull's book, Creativity Incorporated, first came out in 2014. Revised edition came out 2 years ago. Devour the book. The appendix has 33 tips. Implement the 33 tips. It's not easy, of course, it's hard, but it's the playbook. It is the best playbook out there for how you create a culture that encourages creativity.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about your book. The first thing that jumps out for me is you picked 11, which is an interesting number. You would have thought 10 is a nice round number. If you had to go more than 10, maybe you go to 15. How did you land on 11 epic disruptions when you look back in history, Scott? There's got to be a good story behind the 11.
I can, of course, tell a good story. As they say, good stories happen to good storytellers. So, the story I could tell would be I was heavily influenced by the movie Spinal Tap. And if you know, this one goes to 11. And Epic Disruptions came out the same day that Spinal Tap 2 came out. There are
Oh,
no
really?
coincidences in life. But the real reason, it was not a Spinal Tap connection. I started with 8. It got up to 12. 12 was too many. 8 was too few. 11 felt right. I wish I had a more scientific answer than that. It felt right. And, the question that is often behind the question is why those 11? Why do you select, gunpowder, you might say, is kind of obvious. It's a seminal thing, but then you got Julia Child, who makes an appearance halfway through, and that feels really different. Look, you're trying to tell a story. You're trying to illustrate principles. You're trying to have something that's readable. So my selection process was start with the innovator solution, Clay's second book. He had an appendix that lists all the disruptions throughout history and pick out ones that I thought would be interesting. And then once I had that as a starting point, look for others where I was trying to interrogate a few specific questions where looking at that history would teach me something.
Yep.
And there's some things I looked at that ended up being pretty boring. So I was going to have a whole chapter about venture capital, and it ended up being a sidebar in the transistor chapter. I was going to have these deep dives in a couple of the academics, but they were even more boring than the venture capital story. So they just kind of disappeared. And, we ended up with the 11.
Do you have a favorite of the 11? Is there one that says, you know what, this is the one I like the most?
You know, the one that I wrote last is the Julia Child chapter, and that is the one that really has become my favorite. And it's my favorite for 3 reasons. One, people don't see it coming. Like a book about disruption, why Julia Child? Well, I define a disruptive innovation as something that transforms existing markets or creates new ones by making complicated things simple and expensive things affordable. And that's exactly what Julia Child did with her cookbooks and her cooking show. Before Mastering the Art of French Cooking came out in 1961, if you lived in America and wanted to enjoy a great French meal, you had to get in a plane or take a boat to go to France. She democratized that. So that's point number one. Point number two, Julia Child illustrates how people are not born great disruptive innovators. She was not born a great chef. Nobody is. She worked hard at it and followed a set of behaviors that drove the disruptive success. So that's the second reason I love the story. Third, she's just a hoot. You know, you go and look at her
Yeah.
history. I could have gone on. There are already a couple really good memoirs about her, but I certainly could have written longer than I did because she is such a fascinating character. So that's why Julia Child of all the chapters stands out to me.
I like the McDonald's one to me is I now again the movie The Founder is really good with Michael Keaton. But the McDonald's one I think will inspire me to go learn a little bit more about the McDonald's story. To think that they're as successful now as they were, I don't know, what are we, almost 100 years since, like, it's just to think that there's a business out there that has sustained generations and generations of people and customers, and they're just doing what they've been doing, and they're just so successful. It just McDonald's to me is just an amazing, amazing company, and understanding their story on how they how they really, built a factory effectively inside of every McDonald's. It's just amazing.
You know, the other thing, I like all the chapters, of course. It's just like I got 4 kids, which one's
Yeah.
my favorite? I love all of them. But you know, the thing about McDonald's is I love the chapter and there was a missed opportunity in it that I only realized after the book came out. What do I mean by that? So, you know, I had a PR company that was helping me with the book launch, and they said, you should pitch something to AARP, the American Association of Retired People is what it used to be called. But now it's an organization for people who are over 50. And they said, you know, there's a lot of book readers who read their magazine and all that. They said, do you have anyone in your book that's older than 50? I said, that's a good question. I actually had not looked at it through that lens. And I start looking through and I see something remarkable. Just about every chapter, even the printing press, Gutenberg was 54 when the first Bible came off the line. That was in the 1450s. But the McDonald's one, Ray Kroc, who's the seminal figure who turns into the master franchiser of McDonald's, he shows up in San Bernardino, California in 1954 to sell milkshakes, ends up as the master franchiser, milkshake equipment. He was 52. The argument that you could make is there are 2 types of intelligence. There's fluid, which peaks early and begins to decline. That's fast twitch and all that. There's crystallized, that is based on experience and wisdom that can keep going up until you're in your 70s or 80s. If you are truly to reinvent something, crystallized intelligence can be an unlock. So, of course, we make heroes out of the Mark Zuckerbergs that drop out of college and all that. But often the stories of disruptive success have someone like Jensen Huang, who was 55 when NVIDIA introduced the first chip that was used for artificial intelligence, or Ray Kroc or Steve Jobs, who was older than 50 when the iPhone came out. I turned 50 last year, so it's a bit self-serving, but the tagline I would have put in the book is disruption begins at 50.
I look, KFC, right? He was in his, I don't know if you know offhand, but Colonel Sanders, I think he might have been over 60 when, by the time it took off for him. And even, where, my place of employment here at CSI, he founded Constellation in his 40s, and it turned out to be one of the most successful companies within Canada, if not North America. Like this whole thing about how you're going to hit your success in your 20s or your 30s is just not true, and it's a really interesting. I never thought about that until you just brought that up, Scott. It's a really interesting perspective on all of the stories is that, yeah, sometimes success and innovation comes a little later. It's not just the young whippersnappers who figure this stuff out. Sometimes it's maybe you need a little gray hair before you figure this stuff out.
And what's the reason why? So in the chapter about the printing press, one of the points that I made, I asked the question, why was it Gutenberg who did this in Germany? And one of the reasons is Gutenberg was at an intersectional location. So he was at a place where you had people that were engravers. It was a wine growing region. So there were lots of presses there that could be adapted for the printing press. Gutenberg himself was the son of somebody who was a master engraver for the mint. So you had this hodgepodge of things that came together, and one very persistent finding in the innovation literature is that magic happens at intersections when different mindsets and backgrounds collide. The argument that you'd make is someone like Ray Kroc, who had been through the school of hard knocks and done and seen lots of things. He has all these different mental frames that he has in his head that he can combine to see things and do things that other people would not be able to see or do. Now, an interesting aside that one can contemplate, could AI allow a both and solution where you can take somebody who is younger, who's got the snap, crackle, pop of fluid intelligence that can draft on AI in some way to be able to be, I call it metacognition, where they're thinking about how they think and have lots of different frames and all that, and do those both together? I don't know. It's a thing to think about.
Well, you hit on another good one that really made me think from your book as well is we credit jobs and we credit individual folks with coming up with that stuff, but that just again, that's just not true. These are team, there's a leader that emerges, out of, with these innovations, but really this is a team game, not an individual game. You talk in your book, Jobs pulled a lot of his stuff from visiting those Xerox Palo Alto labs, right? Um it's a team game, not an individual game. Do I have that right, Scott?
Absolutely. And the one that, as I reflect on, taught me that most clearly was the one that before the book I had wrong, which is the printing press. So, the story I would tell about the printing press is, the first generation of innovation, kind of prehistoric innovation, if you will, was the lone inventor. It's one person who's working alone in their equivalent of a garage who comes up with something. And they say Gutenberg in the printing press, it was just him until you go and study it and realize it wasn't just him at all. He had a team that was working on things that, in fact, was working on something other than the printing press until the plague broke out. And they had to, in modern terms, pivot. And there's this guy, Conrad Sasspach, that actually has the press itself. And there's Johann Fuss, who provides the funding, and Nicholas Okusa, who sparks the idea of the Bible. Whatever. It is very clearly a team sport. Yes, of course. There's going to be a Gutenberg or a Steve Jobs or an Elon Musk or whatever that is playing an outsized role, but they can't do it on their own. They simply can't.
How much does luck play into the factor as well? I think, a lot of the disruptions, they kind of had a bounce go their way. They made a decision on, maybe early on in their career to do something as opposed to not doing something else, which obviously then leads to something. How much do you think it's luck, or do you think it's something else?
You have a problem whenever you do this kind of study. Survivorship bias is what it
Yeah.
is known as academically. It's like you're looking at things that made it through. And for every example, like the printing press, there's hundreds of things that never made it. Or Steve Jobs and Apple successfully turned around. But most businesses, once they start going down, they never come back up. So one acknowledges that. And one looks at any of these stories and you see the lucky bounces, no doubt, every single time. Julia Child, she had a near death moment where a publisher rejected her book. Second publisher, 1959. She'd been working on it for 5 years. The publisher says, we can't publish it. Well, thankfully, Julia Child had a friend, Avis Devato, who happened to know somebody who was working at Alfred Knopf, who happened to be looking for books that had a French connection. So that feels like a lucky moment. However, where did that luck come from? That luck came from the fact that Julia Child years ago wrote a letter to somebody who wrote an article about the poor shape of American cutlery, which led to the connection to Avis Devato. So Julia Child did the work to create the possibility that luck would happen. And when luck happened, she just drove a truck through it. If you go and look at the people who study serendipity, and there is an entire academic field around it, those are the two things you see. One, creating the surface area, expanding it where there's more possibility for luck to happen. And two, recognizing, realizing, and taking advantage of it. So yeah, of course, there's luck in all of these things, but there is a difference from those who realize the power of it from those who don't.
The other thing too, which stuck out to me in the book is the value of persistence. If these people were faced with challenges, it didn't just arrive to them on a silver platter. all of these folks fought through huge challenges in order to break through. But if you were to look at kind of the characteristics of the people who led this, persistence, I'm intelligence, I'm sure, is high up on the list as well. These people are all brilliant people, but maybe you could craft an argument that actually persistence is actually more important than intelligence. Do you agree with that, Scott?
I do, and yeah, the example that comes to my mind is the first brand in the history of Procter and Gamble to cross $10 billion in annual sales, Pampers disposable diapers, which is a great little story. So the very short version of the story: 1954, Vic Mills, a decorated scientist who is again in his early 60s, is asked to lead a division to go and pioneer new categories. He becomes a first-time grandparent, and he says, "Oh my gosh, disposable diapers are atrociously bad. We should do something about that." In 1956, he commissions a team. Then 1958, they have their first test market, they fail. 1959, they have their second test market, they fail. 1961, they have their third test market, they fail. 1963, they have their fourth test market. Guess what? They failed. Ultimately, they launch in 1965 and become the fastest growing, biggest brand that P&G has ever had. Why did that happen? How did it happen? Why did they persist? Why did they not give up? Well, one way to frame it is to say they failed, 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 failed. Another way to frame it is to say, first and second, they learned about the technology. They didn't have the technology right. Third, they learned about pricing. Fourth, they learned about marketing. Then they were ready to go. What never changed in any of that was a conviction that the problem was worth solving, that there was a big job to be done, that there was a big opportunity. And because of that, they kept going. That's a really big thing, I think, for people to think about right now. A natural question is, are we in the middle of a bubble? Which of these things are going to make it, which are not? To me, it comes back to first principles. If there is something that people have demonstrated is important to them, and there's a solution that makes it easier, more affordable, more effective for people to do it, technology finds a way. If success is predicated on people suddenly prioritizing something that has never been important to them, then those tend to be the flash in the pans. So, if you look at a lot of the things happening right now, what are people using AI for? Companionship and therapy and productivity hacks and all that. Those are really important things. Those have always been really important things. Of course, there'll be winners and losers, and some will make it and some won't. But anyone who says this is a widespread bubble that's not going to have any material impact is not paying any attention at all, in my
Hmm.
opinion.
Yeah. Well, the other thing too is trying to pick the winners from the losers. Like you look at the LLMs out there, there's a lot of different options. But I think if you look at history would say that it kind of converges into a funnel. They have a lot of early competitors and then it kind of whittles itself, it whittles itself down. Picking the winners and the losers is not going to be an easy exercise. Even once you get over the hump that, yes, this technology is here to stay. It's not going anywhere. It's going to disrupt society. But then picking the companies that are actually going to be able to make it through it and the ones that are not going to make it through it, easier said than done.
I agreed. What history says to me, go back and look at the automobile industry. There were hundreds, if not
Absolutely.
thousands, of manufacturers. Ford ultimately makes it through. It gets the business model right. So it figures out how to simplify and streamline, how to go and deliver and support, and how to price. You look at McDonald's. McDonald's is not the first fast food restaurant. It's not the first chain restaurant. But again, it gets the business model right, how it's going to create, deliver, and capture value. You go back to search engines. Google was not the first. It was the 18th major venture capital backed search engine. It got the business model right, how it's going to create, capture, deliver value. So, history could be different this time. But the thing I watch for always is who takes the simplifying technology that powers disruption, the thing that opens up new markets and so on, and then pairs it with a business model that allows the sustainable creation, delivery, and capture of value.
Yeah.
So, it is, again, it could be different this time. Who knows? I spent enough time to know that making clear predictions about the future is a fool's game, but that's at least what the historical pattern shows me.
Absolutely. So let's just talk about a couple of case studies from your book that we haven't yet talked about. Well, we talked about jobs a little bit, but we're going to start with one that we haven't talked about yet. We're going to pick one where a company got massively disrupted and doesn't exist anymore today. And then we'll pick another one who the company, I believe, was one of the first, if not the first, to hit $1 trillion in market cap and is thriving today, despite the fact that their founder, Steve Jobs, passed away several years ago. But let's start with Bethlehem Steel first. there's a lot of people maybe that don't know Bethlehem Steel. I actually didn't know much about Bethlehem Steel before I read the book. But Scott, tee it up for us from Bethlehem. This was one of the iconic steelmaking companies in World War II. Again, they were making profits hand over fist. It was great, and then things started to go sideways. Give us a little bit of tee up Bethlehem Steel for us.
So origin story of this chapter, if you studied under Clay Christensen and you're going to write a history of disruption, you have to have a chapter about steel because it was by far his favorite story. And he would talk about it from the perspective largely of the attacker. Nucor was the big winner in this. It pioneered a format called mini mills. It disrupted the large integrated mills like Bethlehem Steel. In very simple terms, integrated mills are really big, really complicated, really expensive. The last large integrated mill built in the United States was something that Bethlehem Steel invested in the early 1960s. Today's dollars, it was $4 billion of investment. A
Wow.
mini mill is simple. It has an electric arc furnace. It melts scrap steel and turns it into finished product. A new mini mill costs about $30 million. So a huge discrepancy, which leads to a very different business model, which allows the mini mills to make good enough product at lower prices in classic disruptive fashion. So the first time I wrote the chapter, I wrote the story of Nucor. So Nucor was the disruptor, Ken Iverson's its CEO. And the chapter, to one of the reviewers I sent it to, was just really boring. And he said, this story's been kind of told. You've got some more details in it, but it's not interesting. He said, what if you flipped it and looked at it through the eyes of Bethlehem Steel, which I had never done before. I hadn't seen someone study it. And that to me turned into a really interesting exercise because you have here an iconic company. Its foundation goes back to Andrew Carnegie, who is the big player in steel at the turn of the last century. It's got iconic leaders, Charles M. Schwab and Eugene Grace, that are running the organization for 70 years. You mentioned World War II. World War II, 1,121 ships built by
Wow.
Bethlehem Steel, more than a ship a day during one
Wow.
critical year in the war. Its steel is
Wow.
in the Golden Gate Bridge. Its steel is in the Supreme Court. A company that looks like one of these giants that's just going to keep going, that totally blew it in the 60s, 70s, and 80s when the steel mini mills came. So then the question I asked, Clay Christensen said, this story is all about the rational allocation of resources. What Bethlehem Steel did was rationally allocate resources to protect its highest margin, most profitable, most lucrative market tiers, and left the lowest margin, least profitable, least lucrative tiers to the mini mills. And the mini mills just systematically took tier after tier until Bethlehem was pinned at the top end of the market. And he said, basically, there's nothing you can do because it's a rational thing to do. My frame is to say, well, yes, there is a degree of rationality in that resource allocation decision and maybe at the margin, but no one follows a strategy designed to make a company go bankrupt. So there is clearly, too, some irrationality in it. So, what I describe in the chapter is I say in any organization, there are things that exist in the collective unconscious of the organization that play a big role in influencing decisions. I call them ghosts. Every organization has them. If you're not careful, the ghosts of past traumas that you've never gotten over, the ghosts of present patterns that are holding you back, the ghost of future fears that change will invalidate who you are and what your organization stands for, will lead to you sowing the seeds of your own destruction. And I think Bethlehem showed that brilliantly. Sorry, that was a little bit longer answer than you probably were looking for, but that is the Bethlehem Steel story.
No, I think it's interesting that you focused it one way and turned it the other way because I totally again there's because you sort of have two companies that are out there even today. You have companies that are being disrupted, and you have other companies that are up and coming trying to be the disruptor. So trying to see it from both perspectives, I think, is incredibly important. And again, depending on the type of company you work with or work for, you're going to lean in the examples in your book. And some people might lean closer towards Bethlehem Steel. Others might lean towards Apple, depending on on where they are. But just with Bethlehem, to dumb it down and make it simple, again, company is making money hand over fist. I can just imagine, corporate offices galore, people getting huge amounts of bonuses and things like that. Do you think this is an example of they just got so big and so profitable that they just got fat and lazy, and it just went off the rails. Is as opposed to, like I say, a new star who's they got to fight for every nickel. They can barely make payroll. They're looking to save every dollar. When you line those two companies up in a fight, in the long run, you probably know who's going to win.
Well, one thing that the world has continuously taught me is it is very complicated when you get out in the field and start working with companies and you give shorthand answers, but you recognize the reality is always multifaceted. So I'll say two things. One, certainly, I think there is some credence to the fat, dumb, happy argument. One example of it that Jim Collins wrote about in Good to Great. One of the things Bethlehem Steel did when it rebuilt its corporate headquarters in the late 1960s is it designed it like a cross. So it was like a plus sign, because if you have a building that's built like a plus sign, even though it doesn't use geography efficiently, there are a lot of corners. A square building has 8 corners. If you've got a plus sign, you've got 16 corners. So there's that many more corner offices that people can have. Okay, that's a sign of corporate largesse for sure. So I think that's a piece of it. Now, the thing that you would note if you look at the history is Bethlehem continued to innovate. Bethlehem continued to create great steel. Bethlehem continued to do really well when it was about playing yesterday's game. The challenge it had was playing tomorrow's game, saying, yes, we have to continue to deliver high quality sheet steel to automobile manufacturers and figure out economical ways to compete in different parts of the market. So it wasn't like they were so stupid that they weren't doing anything. They were doing a lot of things well, but they were really struggling, like many companies do, with the disruption part. And then you break that into two pieces. One is, to some degree, it makes sense. What does somewhere like the Harvard Business School or the Tuck School of Business teach you? All things being equal, high margin products to demanding customers. At the margin, you would rather do that than a low margin product to a less demanding customer. So again, that's the Christensen resource allocation degree of rational decision making. The irrational is it's just bloody hard to go and do new things. As an example, in the 1980s, one of the CEOs of Bethlehem Steel said, "We can't leave Bethlehem behind. It's our namesake. How can I leave my hometown behind?" A rational decision maker would say, look, Bethlehem is now a high cost location. The factory's been around for 60 years. We just need to shut it down and focus on other things. But it's Bethlehem Steel. That is the identity of the company. It's just brutally hard to do those kinds of things. It's one reason why I love the example. There is no short answer to it. And that's the real world. It's easy to say, hey, the incumbent just misses it. I've never seen that, not once. The incumbent always sees it. It's easy to say they just got stupid. Well, you go and spend time with the people there. And I did not with Bethlehem Steel. It's before my time, but I've been in other boardrooms with companies that have been disrupted. The people would do really well on IQ tests. They're
Yeah.
super smart. They're well-intentioned. It's a really complicated problem. And the thing you give Clay Christensen full credit for, he asked a great question. When he started doing his doctoral research in the 1990s, his question was not, what causes stupid firms to fail? Because that's kind of obvious. They're stupid. His question was, what causes well-run companies that have great leaders to fail? Because that is a really interesting question.
I want to ask you about another one. It's not featured as one of the companies in your book, but I believe you touch on it. Is Kodak. Again, you need to probably be a certain age to know where Kodak once stood in the realm of photography, but it was the cream of the crop. Now it's not that anymore. How many comparables between Bethlehem and Kodak? Do you see the same? Did the same thing repeat, or is the situation at Kodak maybe a little different than what happened at Bethlehem?
Look, so there's two things that you have to do as a leader when disruptive forces are at work in your market. Two things you got to get right. Bethlehem got 0 out of 2, Kodak got 1 out of 2. So one, you have to invest in the new disruptive idea, new disruptive thing. Kodak got that right. People say Kodak missed digital imaging. Totally not true. The digital camera was created within Kodak. Steve Sasson was the engineer who created it. He gave an interview to the New York Times in 2008 or something like that, where he said management's response to the digital camera that he prototyped in 1975 is, that's cute. Please don't tell anyone about it, because they didn't want to lose their business of creating film. So the story goes, but it's not true. Kodak invested billions of dollars to create a digital camera. So you say, okay, well, they had a digital camera, but the real game is about photo sharing through Instagram and all that. Well, here's the thing that most people forget. Kodak was there too. In 2000, they bought Ophoto, one of the early photo sharing sites. There's an alternative universe where Kodak says, hey, what's our tagline? Share memories, share life. Let's make it super easy for people to share not just photos, but news feeds and links and all sorts of other things. That's 2000. Zuck started coding in 2004. So there's another world where Kodak pioneers and owns social media. And imagine how different that world would be if adults who thought responsibly were the ones who developed social media. I am not sure it would be a better world, but I'm pretty sure it wouldn't be a worse world. Anyway, Kodak didn't do that. Kodak bought Photo. It put its brand on it. It turned down the sharing and turned up the ability to print photos. That's the second challenge. Challenge one, allocate resources. Challenge two, reimagine the business and the business model in the face of disruption. Bethlehem did neither of those. Kodak did the first, didn't do the second. That's why it went bankrupt in 2012.
All right, I got to ask you one more because you mentioned news. I'm a newspaper guy, Scott. I like newspapers. I used to
Me
love my sport.
too.
I used to love getting my my Sports Illustrated in the mail. Every whatever it was, every week I would look for or month or whatever it was. I'd look forward to getting my Sports Illustrated magazine, cracking it open, reading Rick Riley on the last page. And again, the same with my newspaper. I used to love getting my newspaper on my front step. And the newspaper industry has been completely disrupted by what's going on. Could the newspaper industry, do you think they could have done anything differently? Obviously, there's been a few, I think, that have probably handled it better than others. But how do you see, where does the newspaper industry rank on your scale of disruption?
Well, it really was the first to bear the full brunt of the internet onslaught, and I was there firsthand. So back when I was at Insight, did a lot of consulting work for the newspaper industry, including a project called Newspaper Next with the American Press Institute in 2005-6, where our mission
Really?
was to save the U.S. newspaper industry. So that one it goes on my failure resume. But a couple observations. So the first thing I'd say is one thing that people don't fully understand, but was so hard for newspapers, the way they actually made money was largely through classified ads. And this, again, you got to be a certain age to know what that is. But these are like little 2 or 3 line things in the back of
Hmm.
the newspaper for play an apartment that's for rent or something for sale, or even singles trying to meet each other.
Yep.
And of course, that was very easily and quickly disrupted by Craigslist, eBay, a whole bunch of other things. The problem was the newspaper companies were essentially addicted to the margins they made from classifieds, and what they were searching for was something that produced equivalent profit streams. And what I and colleagues would say to them, that does not exist. There is no business like this in the world. It's like selling a regulated pharmaceutical product. You don't have God's right to go and do this. What you need to do is figure out how you create a business that gives you something, because something is better than nothing. So I think you had one big problem there. I think the second thing you had is kind of the curse of success. Newspapers as a whole were collectively incredibly profitable, even up until about 2009. There's a lot of noise about what's going on in digital advertising and all that, but the businesses just kept growing. And this is one of the persistent things you see. I call it the information action paradox. By the time the data are clear, and it became clear 2010 and 11, then it's too late.
Yep.
But the problem is in the early days, 2005, 6, the data is not telling you, not screaming at you, you need to change unless you've got a way to say, hey, I see a signal. I can make sense of that signal using a model. We were screaming it in 2005, 6 because we knew about disruptive innovation. We could see what was coming. So, overall, collectively on a 1 to 10 scale, you give the industry about a 2 for its response. It's
So,
not particularly good, but it's hard.
so when you're going in there in 2005 saying, hey, look, like this is coming, you better be, if you don't change now, it's going to be too late. What's their response? Is their response that it's not coming, or is their response say, look, when it comes, we'll deal with it?
It's a little bit of both. So some of it is, well, yeah, I hear what you're saying about Google, but we've got something that Google doesn't. So, one of the big things that got the industry was search-based advertising that Google would sell. They'd say, well, we've got feet on the street. Google doesn't have feet on the street. And you'd say, look, Insight, a small consulting company, we were an early consumer of Google search terms. We never talked to a salesperson. And to us, that was fantastic service.
Yeah.
So, you have the problem that in paradigm shifts, your old mindsets just make it really hard. So, they would be like, yeah, I get this conceptually. However, My income statement still looks pretty good, and I've got these assets that still look pretty strong. I'm not that type of company. I'm not an internet company. I can't be that. Yeah, the thing that's really hard in all of this is, has the production of content gone down in 20 years? Of course not. There is more content now than there ever was before. Obviously, fragmented in very different models. You've got some people like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, or in other countries, Naspers, that have done really well, Bertelsmann in Germany, that have done really well. You have a lot of companies that have not, and then new things that have emerged. I mean, someone had predicted 10 years ago that podcasts, like we're doing now,
Hmm.
that would be a way that information would travel, or that Substacks would be something that would allow direct connections between people. People would not have predicted that. You could see the democratization happening 15, 20 years ago. You didn't know the exact form and business models that were going to emerge.
Well, and that's why even with the newspaper industry, I'm surprised that the pendulum hasn't swung a little bit back, because what, like you say, what the newspapers could always pinpoint to, I think, is the quality of their content. Is their quality of their content was quite high. The processes that they would go through to make sure that what they were reporting was factual. You know, and I'm talking about, like, again, like the Wall Street Journals of the world, the people who care about being right. Because in a lot of cases, if they weren't right, they might get sued by, the people they're writing about. And I'm surprised that even now, when there's so much content out there and you don't know where to look, that there hasn't been a few more newspapers perhaps that say, well, look here, you're going to pay a premium for it, but we're going to make sure that the data is right. And that would be something that, especially when there's so much stuff out there, that you'd think someone would pay for.
I agree. I think I talked about gyms for the brain as one business I expect
Yeah.
someone to build something that says, we're going to do the work to certify. That to me is a big deal. It's like Substack. There are people who I've known for 20 years. It's like, yeah, I trust you that this will, but the new stuff is like, how do you know? How do you know that a new person who's writing something is actually has done the work, is credible, and isn't just spouting out AI driven nonsense? It can be really hard sometimes. That's a business opportunity in my mind.
Yeah, well, look, I don't know how you approach the news, but the way I approach a lot of stuff that I would see on the internet is it's not true. It's not true. If you see a headline or something like that pop up, it's not true unless you dig in and actually research it. You know what I mean? Because a lot of what you read, I'm a sports fan, see something up on my phone saying so and so has been traded, and then you think they've been traded, and then you go and look in and say, well, it's not factually correct. You know what I mean? Like, it's not right. And that's pretty important. You know that you're getting stuff that is fact-based,
I
not,
completely agree. I'm smiling because, my son and I were having the exact discussion. There was some Instagram thing that talked about, oh, Steph Curry was at a golf tournament with Jason Tatum. He's going to be traded to, like, this is just, and then of course there's a digitally altered picture of Steph Curry wearing a Boston Celtics jersey, whatever. It's, people need
well,
clicks.
look, again, I'm up here in Toronto. When Shohei Ohtani was, a free agent and going through his process, there was a pretty reputable reporter who reported that Shohei Ohtani is on a plane up to Toronto,
Hmm.
and it turned out that that was completely nonsense. But it certainly made the rounds here in Toronto. So
It
you know,
is, it is a funny world. That is for sure.
because it's almost like it's more important to be first out there as opposed to be right. You know what I mean? And I hope that changes at some point, where it's actually more important to be factually correct as opposed to just being the first to report something. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
it's interesting. The research shows that things even that are wrong, that get there first, stick in people's brains. So if it bleeds, it leads. If it's fast, it's first. Whatever. It's we will see. I think about questions like this. We've got 4 kids, and I always think about, is the world that they're going to be in a better or worse world? I am an optimist at heart, so I believe in the power of disruption for good. But there is plenty of evidence to the contrary that we have to think about as well.
I agree. I agree with that. So now let's turn from the companies that have been disrupted to one that is the disruptor. And a great example is Apple and Steve Jobs. But I think what is actually very interesting about this story is that Apple, there was when they had came out with the iPhone, there was a chance it wasn't actually going to work. Uh, and early days weren't actually all that great for Apple and the iPhone. Tee up Apple a little bit for us, Scott. And why did Apple, maybe take us through a little bit what happened at the outset and why they were able to eventually take over the market? Because again, this is another one that's a little close home to me, because About 2 hours west of us here in Toronto is the BlackBerry offices. And BlackBerry is still around today. Research in motion. So they're still around. The BlackBerry and the keyboard is not. That is a relic of the past. And the company is actually, they're doing okay. They're starting to have a bit of a resurgence, but they're clearly not what they were back in the 2000s when this was going on. So this is another one that's a little bit close to home for a lot of Canadians. But give us some perspective on Apple.
So I'll make a connection then to research in motion. One of the things I will do when teaching is I will play a video of Jim Balsillie, the co-CEO of Research in Motion, then BlackBerry, from April 2008. And he's on a Canadian chat show and he's talking about state of the world. And it has not aged well as he talks about, he says, the interviewer says, are you worried about the iPhone? Is no. And it says, well, you just do one thing. And Balsillie says something along the lines of, yes, we are a very poorly diversified company. Yes, it either goes to the moon or crashes to the earth, but it's going to the moon pretty well. So we're just going to keep doing what we're doing. And of course, you start with that and you ask an audience, what do you see? People say smug, dismissive, arrogant, myopic, etc. I say, okay, I hear all those things. Press pause. Let's now put on the empathy tap and say, this is someone who helped to build a great company. Why? Someone who is a smart person says things that in hindsight are obviously stupid. Say, okay, you can begin to say at the moment, Research in Motion was wildly successful. Stock prices up 70% over the previous 12 months, revenues had tripled, and they would keep going up. So you've got this information action paradox that I talked about. And we forget the iPhone was far from an overnight success. That iPhone that existed in April 2008 was lacking a very important thing, the App Store. When Steve Jobs first announced the iPhone in early 2007, he said, well, what is the killer app? He said, this visionary, the guy who can see everything, he said, the killer app is making phone calls. The killer app is making phone calls. He went on to talk about how you could download contacts from your Mac and you'd have them all on your phone. Like, whatever, it's totally wrong, totally wrong. So there's no app store. He's very adamant. It's got this great operating system that can access the internet, but it's 2.5G technology, so it's pretty slow. So you can't actually do that much with the phone. There's 16 apps either created by Apple or a couple licensed from third parties. People are saying to him, Steve, it's not going so well. We got to do something different. And to his credit, for as much as people said Steve Jobs didn't listen, he obviously did, because he relented, changed course, the App Store was opened, and the rest is history. That was the unlock moment. The other thing that there's lots that's interesting about the iPhone, but another thing that's really interesting from a historical perspective, Clay Christensen was dead wrong. Clay Christensen did an interview with Business Week, and he said, through my lens, the iPhone is what he would call a sustaining innovation, take an existing solution and make it better. Therefore, he predicted it was going to fail. Now, the thing we had to teach Clay is he was framing it the wrong way. So the first wave of disruption in computing was the mini computer. That happened in the 1960s. There was the personal computer that happened in the 1980s. Then there was the computer in your pocket and palm. That's what Apple really got right. That was the third wave of disruption in computing. The fourth, which will come, will be glasses or contact lenses, or if you like Black Mirror, be the little implant you put on your temple. That will be the next thing that comes. When, exactly how, who knows? But I think the fact that the father of disruptive innovation got this massive disruptive change wrong is really interesting. Then the final thing that I will say about Apple that I just find so interesting, classic disruptive innovation theory. The market leader will not invest in a product that will disrupt what it already has. It might invest in going to do new things and going into new categories, but it will not disrupt itself until you see Apple, who had a fabulously profitable line of portable music players called iPods that it completely destroyed when it launched the iPhone. And at the margin, the iPhone's going to take sales from its laptop division as well. From the perspective of Steve Jobs and Tim Cook afterwards, the goal isn't to protect. The goal is to go and play offense, go and create and do what is right ultimately for the consumer. And in the end, things will work out. And that's just, I think, a really interesting part of the story.
Yeah, look, for people, especially the youngsters out there that don't realize, there's a reason why they called the BlackBerry the Crackberry, is people were addicted to it. They were addicted to the keyboard, and it was the dominant player. And yeah, maybe things look obvious in hindsight, but like one of the things you reference in the book is the battery life. the battery life of a BlackBerry was way longer
Oh
than
my
an
God.
iPhone.
I will ask
And
people, if
who would have thought that people would be cool with having to charge their phone potentially multiple times a day? Now you're getting the whole internet baked on your phone, but that was another thing with the BlackBerry is that you certainly didn't have to charge the BlackBerry multiple times a day like you did with the iPhone.
one of the things I will do with groups now, assuming they're of a certain age, I'll be telling this story. I'll say, "Who misses their BlackBerry?" And everyone's hand goes up. And I say,
Yeah.
"Tell me a story." And they'll talk about, when they first got the right keyboard and the red light blinking and the fact that these, whatever, they talk about games that they play and all
Yep.
that. And, I do think there's an alternative universe where you can see two different streams for BlackBerry. One stream is, hey, it actually figures out haptic and touch and all that. The technology people are smart enough. So there's a competitive product stream. There also is a business model stream. I wrote an article in 2009. So this is not, Monday morning quarterbacking or whatever, where I said what I would do is I would say, what is Research in Motion really good at doing? It's really good at encryption, bandwidth management, making sure that you can remotely monitor devices. That sure sounds like something that would be a good AAS. You just turn that into security as a service that you then go and
Yep.
sell to Apple and everybody else. And, who knows? Maybe that was impossible. I'm not a technology person, but you can imagine. I mean, history shows incumbents are not powerless when disruption strikes. Apple is one of just many examples. Microsoft is another recent one of large established companies that have learned how to deal with disruptive change. There's no reason why Research in Motion, BlackBerry couldn't have been on that list as well.
I agree with you. I totally agree. Now we talk about, I loved your question, from Clay. It's not that, stupid companies go under. It's actually really smart people who run these companies that go under. And why does that happen? So Scott, maybe I'll ask the question to you. Why does that happen? Is there an easy answer? Or again, these are large companies, lots of different things going on. They've got cultures. Again, it's not like a clean answer, but to the best you can, why do these large successful companies run by smart people disappear?
The question has gotten harder, not easier to me. And this is, I'm in the process of writing my next book. Is you've got these ideas fermenting at the moment. And the way I start that book is I say, I have been trying to solve a whodunit since 1997. And the whodunit is the book, The Innovator's Dilemma. Because in that book, somebody dies. It is a large company that dies. And every book that's about someone dying, you have to have a suspect, the person that went in and killed the large company. And what Clay argues, it's the resource allocation process. And if that is the case, then we had the answer to that in 2003. Yet 20 plus years of field experience showed me you could tell people very clearly. You set up a structure like this, you have a system like this, you have a strategy that does this, you have portfolios that do this. You could tell them all those things and they still wouldn't do it. So it says, okay, there is something else here. The conclusion that I have reached, it is, for now at least, organizations are run by humans. Humans have biases and blind spots as individuals. You put them together in teams and groups, those compound. The humanity in a world that is characterized by a huge amount of fog, where the right answer isn't clear, or there are barriers you can't see, it can be kind of scary to go and progress through it, and it's not lifting anytime soon, is the biggest enemy. Now, the good news is there's enough research around that if you accept it, you can learn to say, okay, here's the reason why I, as a leader, suffer from confirmation bias. So I'm not properly seeing the right signals. I've got to learn to look in different places and amplify them in different ways. You can learn to say, hey, the invisible barriers in my organization, the ghosts we were talking about in the case of Bethlehem Steel, I put the right night vision or spectral goggles on, I can see them very clearly and I can deal with them. You can say, the fact that it's really uncomfortable, I know how to make sure that there's a place in my organization that can hold some of the emotions that come along with it. There are answers to all of those things. It's not easy, it's complex stuff, but the answers are there. The proof points are there. I think it really comes down to, are you going to go deep into your organization's psyche? Because that's where the real root of the problem is, I think.
Let's take a couple examples of leaders because let's start with Jobs. With Steve Jobs, I've never worked with Steve Jobs before, but from everything I read, he's not the easiest guy, or he wasn't the easiest guy to work with. You talk in your book about the reality distortion field of Steve Jobs, which is probably a kind of a nice way to describe how hard, how tough he was on some of the people around him. But again, you look at innovation with Steve, the Apple, Pixar. There's a whole bunch of different things. How important is that leader? How important is it to have like a Steve Jobs type as your leader? And is there only a few of these people on the planet that can actually do this? Or do you see it as more of a skill that you could learn? Like what can leaders take away from, learning something from like a Steve Jobs who really again led disruption?
Yeah, so I'd say a couple things. So first, I always try to take it away from the person and look more at the behaviors. So, there are different archetypes of leaders that have driven disruptive change. So Steve Jobs is very different from Satya Nadella, who was CEO of Microsoft. He's done a very similar thing, temperament-wise, orientation-wise, very, very different people. Yet the behaviors that they both follow are very similar behaviors. So big believers in Steve Jobs's case in innovating at the intersections. So going all the way back to him studying calligraphy when he was at Reed College and then going to Xerox PARC and taking different ideas. He once said famously, if you ask a creative person how they did it, they often feel a little guilty because creativity is nothing more than connecting things. And Satya Nadella follows the same behavior where you say, okay, we've got our cloud business, we've got our enterprise software business. We're not going to have these as two things. We're going to combine them as one. Okay. We're not doing as well as we can in artificial intelligence. Let's go and pioneer an investment in OpenAI and do that really early and use it as a way to get far in front of people, not feeling like you have to do it on your own, but bringing different things together. So that's a behavior. A behavior to be, Jeff Bezos described it once, willing to be misunderstood for long periods of time, not thinking about, are you going to get it right this week, month, or quarter, but are you following something that's going to deliver over years and decades? That's something that you see as a very common element. And creating space and nurturing those things that are different. Go back to early in Steve Jobs' career when he's working on the Mac, the idea of the separate building where they put the Jolly Rogers pirate flag up and say, we have a space where this tribe that's doing different things can do different things is a really common element. I wish for a world where you could have the positive business outcomes of reinvention, renewal, disruptive growth without some of the maybe toxic side effects of the other behaviors at times. So, Elon Musk would be another data point that would suggest there is a certain bracing type that runs organizations that drive disruptive change. Those are only two people, and there's lots of other organizations that have succeeded with disruption. So I don't know. I wish for kindness.
Elon Musk is such an interesting example because I think if you look at the number of disruptions that Elon has undertaken, whether it's electric cars, SpaceX, or there's just so many different companies and,
PayPal before, the Boring
oh my
Company,
God,
Neuralink, and
it, like the world has a lot to thank Elon for, frankly. And maybe it's the thanks won't come until 50 years down the road when all of a sudden, yeah, we've got to relocate the planet to Mars or something like that. You know what I mean? But on the flip side, like you say, I'm not sure he'd be the best guy to work for. You certainly have to have a special personality to work for Elon. You probably have to have pretty tough skin and be able to brush off what he says and really just focus on the end game. Give us your 2 cents on Elon. Where do you see him on the scale of successful CEOs who can really disrupt things?
Undoubtedly, he is the disruptive force of our time. I mean, there's no question about it. You go back to PayPal before, and then Tesla, Solar City, SpaceX, things that are being done with Starlink, Neuralink, et
Yeah.
cetera. So, the ability to really reimagine and then work really hard, fundamental scientific principles to go and make it reality and say, okay, we've had assumptions about how things work. Maybe they're wrong. Maybe we can really rethink it in quite a radical way things. So a lot to admire about the business and business outcome. And in terms of people working for or with him, you go back to Steve Jobs too. In Creativity Incorporated, Ed Catmull, who was the longtime CEO of Pixar, said, look, you don't know what Steve Jobs was like. Let me tell you about the kind, caring, trustworthy, thoughtful person that I saw. So, there always are more
Yep.
complexities to these humans than what we see characterized in mass media. So there's a little bit of that. And I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect there's a lot of people who are like, hey, I'm working at SpaceX. I'm an engineer that wants to push frontiers. I can do whatever I want here. This is my dream job. This is exactly what I want. I want to be someone who's pushing limits. I want to be someone that's disrupting, et cetera. So, along some dimension, that's a really powerful thing. Now, I think if you look at what happened with Doge in the United States, you see some of the limits of Elon Musk. One commentator, I thought this was quite good. One commentator said Elon Musk is amazing at complicated problems where there's just lots of different components to them. You have to untangle them, etc. Elon Musk is not great at complex problems where there are systems that have interactions and complexity where you don't know exactly what knock on effects will be. And a national government is a complex living organism that you cut one thing and weird things happen in other places.
Yep.
So, I thought that was an interesting point of view. So, what I teach my kids is there's something to learn from everyone. That's something that Clay Christensen taught me. So you go and look and study, and ultimately, as an individual, you're deciding what you're picking up and what you're discarding. There's a lot to learn from Elon Musk and maybe some things to discard as well.
Yeah, well, you would know as well as anybody, the corporate world and the government world or the private institution world, those are two different worlds with two different cultures. And just because something might be very successful in the corporate world, where you can kind of, especially if you're the owner, you can really do whatever you want to do. And you can drive people, pretty hard. And if it doesn't work out, you just replace them and bring in other folks. That same playbook might not work as well inside of a government institution. You know what I mean? And you bring up Doge. That's how, when I reflect, that's kind of how I had saw it, is that same playbook just didn't work as well inside of that
Agree.
organization.
And
But
of course, it's more complicated or complex than that. But yeah, I think that's a good overall summary. Meant
now
more
the oth-
talking
the
about that branch, but that's probably for a type of podcast.
the other thing I want to ask you about, because the other thing that is to me amazing about Apple, and I don't know if they get enough credit for this or not, but one of the things that I thought when Steve Jobs passed the reins to Tim Cook, I said, "There's no way Apple is going to be as successful after Steve Jobs than before Steve Jobs." And I think it's actually a credit to Steve Jobs that Apple has, you know, been so successful since Steve Jobs passed over the leadership to Tim Cook. That somehow he passed that creativity. He created an environment that could actually withstand him leaving. Um, and how did he do that? Like, how do you? I'm sure succession planning was one of the things that you guys worked on at Insight, because that's critical in terms of, But how do you build an environment that can sustain multiple leaders?
It's a great question. And I don't know that I know for sure, but I'm going to give you two hypotheses. So, first, if you go back to research in motion for a minute, one of the things that I remember doing once is I just did a very quick compare the boards of directors of Apple and Research in Motion around 2008. And it was really interesting because you look at Research in Motion, for the most part, it was CEOs of really, 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 really big companies. So companies that were global scale companies, oil and gas companies and so on. You looked at Apple's board, it was a creative destruction board. So there was the founder of Genentech, there was a venture capitalist on it, Eric Schmidt from Google was on it. You had Al Gore when Al Gore was in his inconvenient truth moment. So just something where you could ferment and have different points of view around things. So that's part one. And then part two, about, I don't know, is when Jobs is still alive. So maybe it was 20 years ago now. Apple did something really interesting. They set up a university. And at that university, they hired somebody who was the former dean of the Yale School of Management and brought in really good business academics to work full time at Apple. And their only job was, in
Hmm.
essence, distill down Jobs, distill down his essence, and find a way to teach it to everybody. So I'm pretty fascinated by that because, there are a small number of companies in the world that are principle based, not like moral or ethical, but they follow certain principles. So you look at Amazon's website, there are 16 principles like have backbone, disagree, and commit, and all that. And the hypothesis would be if you are a principle based company and you develop mechanisms to instill and reinforce those principles, you can go from Jobs to Cook, you can go from Bezos to Jaffe, and the organization can retain the magic that it had before. I would love for that to be true. I not enough sample to really say that conclusively, but those are the things that I think are interesting. So, if I go back to Insight, one of the things that I tried really hard to do when I was there is say, what is the heart of Insight? Well, the heart of Insight is a set of values, and those values are intellectual curiosity and humility and so on, many of them tracing back to who Clay Christensen was as an
Yeah.
individual. Can we figure out ways to have this be a company where from day one, that's what people live? And if you can do that, it doesn't matter. Clay passed away in 2020. I left the organization in 2022. Doesn't matter. If those values are inculcated from day one, the institution continues to function no matter who is there.
Did they do that at Insight, do you think?
I did imperfectly. Every organization does it imperfectly, but it's certainly, I think, a lot of good effort to do that.
Because it's so easier said than done. It's such a difficult thing to replace a leader. I could imagine when Clay left Insight that, it's a difficult time. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's
And
an
Clay in
incredible and
particular,
you can't replace a Clay Christensen. You know what I
yeah, I'd
mean? Like it's
agree.
impossible.
It's just, there's a lot of halo effect that comes from Clay Christensen in both just just he was one of the best human beings you would ever meet. So, there's the halo effect was in multiple ways. It's a hard thing. And, it's just that the world of professional services is a very hard world as well. So, despite all that, it is last I heard, Insight record revenues, record performance is firing on all cylinders and has a great leader right now in Andy Waldick. So it's doing fantastic work.
Is there is there key skills that we can teach the workforce to say, look, is that if you want to build an innovative culture, the workforce should have this, that, or the other thing? Is there anything we can take from that, Sky? We talked a lot about the leaders
Yeah.
and the importance of having a leader, but what about at the workforce level?
If I were to simplify everything down to one word, Scott, it would be curiosity. And that
Yeah.
I think is really important because in a world that is changing as much as our world is changing, the desire to keep learning, the willingness to go and look a little stupid as you try new things, and a culture that accepts that. To me, there's nothing that's more important. You can branch that into experimentation and all sorts of other things, but curiosity to me is the most important thing. And to me, a lot of curiosity is not teaching people, it's reminding them. As again, I mentioned I've got 4 kids. No one had to teach the kids how to be curious because kids are naturally curious. Curiosity is something that is unlearned as you go to school and work, and people tell you right answers and wrong answers and ways to do things and ways not to do things and guardrails and all that. I think we have to, I don't think, I am sure we have to release a lot of that if we want organizations to thrive. I mean, we get real problems right now. I was just looking at the Gallup State of the Workforce Survey, and they said that their estimate is that lack of employee engagement is a $10 trillion drag on the global economy. Global economy is about 150 trillion, so 10 trillion is a pretty big deal. And that's just lack of engagement. I think in a world that's dealing with everything we're dealing with now, engagement is leading to anxiety, is leading to stress, is leading to burnout, is leading to very bad health outcomes. Curiosity and fun, those are the antidotes to those issues. Work is called work, but I think we need to bring a little bit more joy to it.
You know what? It's so ironic that we have all this technology at our hands, which didn't exist in the 80s and 90s. I think about some of the summer jobs and even I think about, the jobs my parents had done. This technology is supposed to make our lives easier. You know what I mean? And it's just,
It's
it's almost like the reverse as people are more burned out, more stressed out. Maybe it's because it's impossible to turn off now. I don't know what the answer is, but it's certainly ironic that, it's almost like maybe the workforce is worse off today than we were 30 years ago, you know what I mean? Or
Yeah,
whatever it
I
may
can't
be.
remember the name for it, but there is a paradox for it that the great productivity enhancing tools actually lead to you doing more work because you get so productive. There's just more things that you can do. I think some of this is calling your spots or picking your spots and making some good choices. This is a big thing that I try to teach the students about when I talk about AI use to say, look, you now have this superpower, but you have to be careful because if you turn your life over to the superpower, you're never going to learn anything. So you have to make sure, particularly in an academic environment, that you're still encountering friction because that's the way you learn. And also, pick the spots where AI can really enable you to take things to another level. I mean, as an instructor, one thing that I have loved doing is I can now use AI to come up with very short simulations to teach concepts, which 5, 10 years ago, that was really complicated. You have to do pen and paper and cards, and thinking through that is really hard. Now it's like with the right prompts and the right back and forth, I've got a little 5-minute game people can play where they're like, oh, I get it. If I invest only in today's business, that's bad. And if I invest only in tomorrow's business, that's bad. And I've got to balance it in the right way. And they don't hear me say that, they experience it. So that ability to me has been an unlock from a teaching perspective. And to the students, I say, find the same thing for you. Find the place where you really do get a huge productivity boost or enables you to do what you can't do, and then do the hard work of actually reading the case and sitting with it and struggling with it and doing the analytics problem set and all that. Because if you don't do it now, you're never ever going to learn. And that will be a real problem.
I totally agree. I think we'll talk a little bit about AI because again, it kind of leads into this next discussion here. But I think one of the $1 million questions out there right now is, this generative AI, is that going to supplement the workforce or is that going to replace the workforce with, a new form? And I certainly believe in the former that, as with a lot of technologies, whether it's email or again, you go back in time, there's been a lot of disruptive technologies that I think have really changed the way we work. It's really allowed us to get more done in our day. Um, and, now we're faced with this generative AI. Where do you see it, Scott? Do you see it as this will ultimately be, and I'm not talking 100 years from now, I'm talking maybe you look forward 3 to 5 years, as it's being something that really supplements what we're doing and we're able to do more with a lot less? Or do you see it as, what, the world's going to be replaced by robots?
I, Elon Musk just said something the other day that if you're in medical school, don't study surgery because by 2029, all surgery will be done by robots, which, what do I know? I think that is just wildly wrong. My own personal view based on experience being inside large organizations, experience as a teacher, experience as a person, we've got great tools that can enhance many things we can do. Are there some professions that will decline, if not disappear? Of course. There used to be people who were switchboard operators. There used to be a big business in the manufacturing and distribution of ice before there was refrigeration. So of course, inevitably, there will be decline in some places. It will be very rapid in some places, but there will be growth of new things, AI ethicists and people who are judgment guides inside organizations, et cetera. And history shows, Carlotta Perez has done great research in GPTs, not a generative pre-trained transformer, but general purpose technologies. The employment always grows. This time could be different. It's possible, the job apocalypse that sometimes people talk about. Who knows? You have to believe a certain set of things about how much things develop. And remember that right now, large language models are really good at some knowledge intensive tasks. Like if you need to solve a really complex math problem that has limits to it, but most of the world doesn't need to do that. Most of the
Yeah.
world needs to go and, cook dinner for their kids and have their mind figure out what they're going to say in a speech and then actually say it when they're on stage and all that kind of stuff. So, I net and more in the enhancement category, and particularly as a parent, the thing that I am really worried about is what we talked about. When I was in school, I could buy something called Cliff's Notes, which would give the executive summary of a book. I could do that. Or I
Hmm.
could go to a bathroom and in the stall next to me, someone might sell the answers to a test. That was hard and you felt kind of dirty doing it. Now, there's no friction and you don't feel guilty doing it. The problem is, again, you don't learn without friction. So, it's like I tell my kids, a couple of them are into sports and they like going to the gym to lift weights. If the job is to lift as much weight as possible, you bring a forklift in, the job is done. But that's not why you're there, right? You're there because you
Hmm.
want these muscles in your arms to be bigger. You want the gray matter in your head to be bigger. It's got to stress and strain and sweat it the same way.
Well, look, and you could take a shortcut. You go to the gym. I'm sure those people at the gym saying, "Hey, take this or that and the other," and you can shortcut the process. And but there's a cost to doing that. It's maybe a little different analogy, but like you said, there's a benefit to going through the process. The other thing too, just going back to what Elon Musk says. Yeah, I think the other thing that's happening is the population is going up and up and up. And if you had robots to do the surgeries, let's just use as an example, I would assume that you would still need a human in the loop who's going to be involved.
Elon Musk,
I would,
right now, but whatever. Yes, of
I,
course you would.
I just find that really hard to, but like even for litigation reasons, see, like if something goes sideways, like who's going to get sued? I guess you'd say the company, but You would have thought there's some human in the loop, even the people who are building it. But in any event, we are going to have to get more efficient and effective as a society in order to service a growing population. Like there's so, I don't know what the lineups are in the US for surgeries, but in Canada, they're certainly pretty long. If you can build technology that all of a sudden can get more people through the system, that doesn't mean less jobs per se. You know what I mean? It just, you're able to do more with less, right?
And to me, this goes back to the argument Clay Christensen made about healthcare. The way that healthcare policy issues were framed in this country were, how can we afford healthcare? And Clay said the actual best frame is, how do we make healthcare more affordable? The way you make it more affordable is through disruptive solutions that take complicated things, make them simple, take expensive things, make them more affordable, allow lesser trained providers to go punch up and do more. That could be a great shift in something that takes up one in every $5 of the economy down here. So, in the end, I'm an optimist. I believe that we're going to see some amazing things in the years ahead. I'm also a realist. There will be winners and losers as you do it. One thing that I think a lot about, I think a lot about the 1920s in the chapter about the automobile. 1920s, Henry Ford's achieved his vision, the car for the great multitudes, great for Henry Ford, great for motorists, not very good for pedestrians in cities, because the cities are not built for cars, they're built for people and horses. So sadly, people were dying. How'd you get through it? Three things. You had new technologies like traffic lights. You had norms, like when we get to an intersection, this is the order in which we go. And critically, you had regulation. You need to have a driver's license to drive a car. There are going to be speed limits, and ultimately, there are going to be seat belts. The thing that I wonder about is, are we going to get the regulations for artificial intelligence? Without it, I think some really bad things are going to happen. We will ultimately get it. It's a question of, do we get it before or after horrifically bad things have happened?
Yeah. I totally agree. And I think most, I hate to say most, I think there's a lot of AI leaders out there who I think believe that government regulation is really important to make sure that things don't run away too far. The other thing I want to ask you just quickly about, Scott, is, you look through history and one of the constants is human interaction is really important. It's important that humans interact with other humans. And what we're talking about here, whether it's robots or chatbots or whatever, is we're kind of moving away from that. And I guess one of the pillars I always thought was robots and AI can't take over because humans ultimately need other human interaction. And that will be one of the things that kind of keeps things at bay a little bit. Do you see it the same way, or do you see that could also be something where you wake up one day and, hey, you're cool with just dealing with robots and chatbots all day long?
And I wish for a world where humans still talk with and spend time with humans. You look at other data. So, I don't know, but so data that you look at. So Harvard Business Review had an article, how are people actually using AI? Number one use is therapy and relationships. So that is evidence. Joanna Stern just had a book. What is the title of the book? I Am Not a Robot is the title of her book. She spent 2025 just doing all things on AI. And she said the thing that was scariest is when she tried out, with approval from her spouse, she tried out doing dating on AI. And she said, you
Wow.
can fall in really fast. You can fall in really fast. So again, I wish for, I hope for, I expect a world where human to human, but there's at least some data to suggest that we as a species are kind of sad, lonely, and lost, and technology will fill the gap.
Fair enough. All right, let's wrap it up. You referenced another book coming down the pipe. Obviously, again, you could probably write 100 books on disruption these days. You could probably go 100 different ways. Can you give us a little bit of a sneak peek, Scott, on maybe what we can expect in the near term? What's the topic du jour now for the next book?
Yeah, so the tentative title is Leading Through the Fog. The basic argument is we're in a world where disruption has gone from episodic to endemic, which means we're in a fog that is disorienting, it is deceptive, it is depressing. And unlike fog in the natural world that dissipates, it is very persistent. And what I then argue in the book is there are a set of behaviors that you have to follow to seize the opportunities in the fog. And each of those four problems, there's two behaviors. So you have to act when the data tells you not to, lead by letting go, et cetera, et cetera. So a little bit of how do you go and thrive in today's world with some stories of the thought leaders who have provided the ammunition to go and do the things you need to do.
Is there a tentative release date? When can we expect it?
It depends on how fast I write it and how much pressure I can put on the publisher. I just literally signed the contract 2 days ago. So
Okay.
I'm hoping it comes out in late 2027. I'm expecting it will come out in early 2028.
Okay. All right, cool. Well, in the meantime, definitely for anybody listening, take a read of Epic Disruptions. Again, if especially if you like, well, look, I enjoy history, so I really enjoy reading about the disruptive technologies. But really, the question is, what can you learn from those to apply today? And I think that's as relevant that's relevant for everybody, whether you're being disrupted in perhaps a company like that, or whether you're in another company where you're the disruptor. I think either way, you're going to get a different perspective. But Scott, thank you very much for spending the time. We could have talked for a heck of a lot longer. This was a lot of fun. Hope to have you back when your new book is out. But thank you very much. And again, we really appreciate you taking the time this afternoon.
Scott, truly my pleasure. Anytime a Scott asks, the answer is always yes.
All right, that's awesome. Thanks.